1965, the year everything changed. Medicare passed, Watts burned, we sent troops to Vietnam, the Interstate Highway Act was rewiring America, and the first Walmart opened in Arkansas, promising that soon every town would look exactly the same. But here's what nobody talks about. Some towns said no, some towns got bypassed, some towns went broke at exactly the right moment, and some towns just stopped, froze themselves in amber before the homogenization, before the chain stores, before downtown died and moved to a strip mall off the highway. We're not talking about ghost towns, we're talking about living, breathing communities where the same family still runs the pharmacy with the soda fountain, where the neon signs aren't retro, they're original, where downtown isn't a nostalgic concept, it's where people actually go. Towns that look like the opening scene of a movie set in 1965, except the people aren't actors and the businesses aren't props. Some stopped by accident, geographic isolation, economic collapse at just the right moment, a highway that went around them instead of through them. Others stopped on purpose, looked at what was coming and said, no thanks, we'll keep what we have. And here's the thing that'll surprise you. Most of these places aren't dying. They're not desperate. They're not waiting for progress to circle back. They found something most of America lost. Authenticity, community, the kind of main street where people still know your name. The trade-off? You won't find a Starbucks. You might not find fast internet, but you will find something we bulldozed everywhere else. So we're going on a road trip. 8 towns that stopped in 1965 before everything changed. Some you've heard of, most you haven't. All of them are real, verified, and still operating like Eisenhower's still president. Hit subscribe because you're about to see an America that wasn't supposed to survive. Let's start in the desert, where a town got bypassed and became a legend. Number 8, Seligman, Arizona, the Route 66 bypass. We're standing on what used to be the main street of America. Route 66, the mother road, 2 lanes of blacktop that connected Chicago to Los Angeles and built the American West. In 1965, Seligman, Arizona was thriving. Motels with neon signs shaped like cowboys and cacti. Diners serving blue plate specials. Gas stations where attendants checked your oil and washed your windshield. Every car heading west stopped here. Every family road trip made memories here. Then 1978 happened. Interstate 40 opened. 4 lanes of efficient nothing that bypassed Seligman by 7 miles. Overnight, the traffic disappeared. The motels went dark. The diners closed. Most Route 66 towns died quietly, demolished their old buildings, moved to the interstate, became the same as everywhere else. Seligman refused. The Delgadillo family, who'd run the Snowcap Drive-In since 1953, decided they weren't abandoning what their father built. Angel Delgadillo became the unofficial mayor of preservation. The town kept the neon burning, kept the vintage signs, kept the mom and pop spirit. They didn't restore it. They just never let it die. According to the Seligman Chamber of Commerce, roughly 80% of the buildings on historic Route 66 through town are original structures from the 1950s and 60s. The Roadkill Cafe still serves in a building that opened in 1951. The Copper Cart gift shop operates out of a 1960s gas station. The neon signs aren't reproductions. They're the same tubes of gas that glowed in 1965, still glowing today. Median home price in Seligman sits around $185,000 according to Zillow data. That's $185,000 for an actual house with character in a town that Pixar immortalized. Roughly what a parking space costs in San Francisco, except this one comes with a front door and functioning plumbing. The population is roughly 450 people, almost identical to what it was in 1965. They didn't grow, they didn't shrink, they just persisted. Here's what happened. Pixar animators researched Route 66 for the movie Cars, spent time in Seligman, and based the entire fictional town of Radiator Springs on what they found here. The message wasn't subtle. This is what America used to look like before we paved it over with sameness. Picture this. Early morning on Route 66 through Seligman. The sun rises over the desert, turning the vintage neon pink and gold. You smell coffee brewing at the Route 66 diner. Hear the bells on the door of Delgadillo's barbershop. See a classic car roll through town because this is where classic cars still belong. It's not a theme park, it's Tuesday. The trade-off? You're 90 minutes from Flagstaff for serious medical care, 2 hours from a real grocery store, and the only jobs are tourism and keeping the past alive. But if you wanted what everyone else has, you wouldn't be here. From Seligman, we head to New Mexico, where a mining town went broke and got rescued by artists who wanted exactly what the developers didn't. Number 7. Silver City, New Mexico, the mining town that became an art colony. Silver City, New Mexico, population 9,600, elevation 5,900 feet, sitting in the Gila National Forest where the desert meets the mountains and the Old West never quite left. This was Billy the Kid country, copper mining country, boom and bust country. In 1965, the mines were still running, the smelter was still operating, and the town was still a working-class Western outpost doing what it had done since the 1870s, pulling metal out of the ground and hoping the price held. Then the copper market collapsed. The Kennecott mine scaled back operations through the 1970s, finally closing major operations in the 1980s. Silver City should have become another mining ghost town, another boarded up downtown, another casualty of economic transition. But something unexpected happened. Artists showed up, cheap rent, Victorian architecture, high desert light, geographic isolation that kept the developers away. Silver City became an art colony by accident, and the artists did something crucial. They preserved what was already there instead of tearing it down for condos. The result is a downtown that looks almost identical to its 1960s self, except now the storefronts sell paintings instead of mining equipment. According to the Silver City Historic Preservation Commission, the downtown historic district contains 163 contributing structures, the majority dating from 1880 to 1960 with minimal alteration to facades or interiors. The Palace Hotel, built in 1882, still operates. Jalisco Cafe has served Mexican food in the same location since 1949. Same family, same recipes. Vicky's Eatery operates from a 1950s storefront that was a drugstore in 1965. The old Silco Theater, built in 1923, was restored in recent years, but kept its Art Deco bones intact. Downtown still has local hardware stores, family-run diners, businesses that have been operating continuously since the Eisenhower administration. No Walmart in downtown, no Starbucks, no national chains visible from the main street. Median home prices in Silver City run around $285,000 per Zillow data from late 2024. That buys you an actual historic home, often with original adobe construction, wooden floors worn smooth by generations, and a location within walking distance of everything that matters. The population in 1960 was about 7,500. Today it's around 9,600. They grew but slowly, organically, without losing what they had. Here's the preservation model that worked. Silver City never got rich enough to tear itself down. The mining bust meant no money for redevelopment. By the time the economy stabilized in the 1990s and 2000s, the artists and preservationists had enough influence to protect what remained. They didn't restore it to theme park standards. They just kept using it. Jobs are limited. Western New Mexico University is the largest employer, followed by the school district and county government. The coffee shop closes at 3 p.m., which either means you've discovered work-life balance or you're having an existential crisis about your afternoon caffeine dependency. Your late day options: adapt or drive to Deming. Picture this: afternoon in downtown Silver City. The sun filters through the cottonwoods along Bullard Street. You smell roasting chili from Jalisco Cafe. Hear the bells of the Methodist Church, built in 1882. See locals sitting on benches outside shops that have been there since before your parents were born. It feels solid, lived in, real. Not because someone designed it that way, because nobody had money to ruin it. The trade-offs are what you'd expect from southern New Mexico. Summer heat pushes 95 degrees regularly. The nearest commercial airport is 2 hours away in El Paso. Major medical care requires a drive. If you need a corporate career, you're leaving. But if you remember when downtowns were where life happened, when stores were owned by people you knew, when architecture had character and communities had identity, Silver City kept all of that. Not on purpose at first, just by being too broke to destroy it and too stubborn to quit. One longtime resident told us, "We're not trying to be 1965. We just never stopped being 1965. There's a difference." There is, and that difference is getting harder to find. From the high desert mining town, we head north to Washington State, where a town made a deliberate choice to freeze itself, though not quite in the way you'd think. Number 6. Leavenworth, Washington, the intentional time capsule. Leavenworth, Washington, population 2,300, nestled in the Cascade Mountains, where the Wenatchee River cuts through pine forests, and the scenery looks like a postcard from the Alps. And that's exactly the point, or at least what you're supposed to think. Leavenworth is famous for its Bavarian theme, every building designed to look like it belongs in Bavaria, not Washington. Tourism brochures call it America's Bavarian Village. It's charming, it's coordinated, automated and it's completely manufactured. But here's what they don't tell you. Underneath the Bavarian facades, Leavenworth is pure 1960s small-town America, preserved by the very act of disguising it. In 1965, Leavenworth was dying. The Great Northern Railway had rerouted in 1929, taking the town's reason for existing with it. Highway 2 brought some traffic, but not enough. Downtown was decaying, businesses were closing, and the town needed a lifeline. So in 1965, they made a decision: rebrand completely. Two businessmen visited Solvang, California, saw the Danish theme working there, and decided Leavenworth would go Bavarian. They didn't tear down the buildings, they couldn't afford to. Instead, they wrapped the existing 1920s to 1960s structures in Alpine-style facades, painted murals, added shutters and flower boxes, turned the motor lodge into a Bavarian inn, the diner into a guest house, the hardware store into something that looked like it belonged in the Alps. The bones stayed the same, only the skin changed. According to the City of Leavenworth Historic Preservation Commission, the core downtown contains 47 buildings, most constructed between 1920 and 1965, with Bavarian overlay added starting in 1965 and continuing through the early 1970s. What's remarkable is what didn't change: the street layout, the building footprints, the scale, the local ownership structure. Leavenworth still doesn't allow chain stores in the core downtown. McDonald's exists, but it's disguised in Bavarian architecture and barely visible. The businesses are still largely locally owned. The old motor lodges from the 1950s and 60s are still operating, just painted to look alpine. The downtown commercial district still functions as it did in 1965. Walking distance, human scale, everything you need within a few blocks. Median home prices in Leavenworth run around $575,000 per Zillow data. That's expensive, driven by tourism and Seattle money buying second homes. But the town itself hasn't sprawled into strip malls and subdivisions. It's stayed compact, walkable, oriented around that 1960s downtown core that they disguised but never destroyed. Here's what's ironic: Leavenworth is famous for being fake. Everyone knows the Bavarian thing is manufactured, but in being fake, they preserved something real: the structure and function of a 1960s mountain town. The hardware store still sells hardware. The grocery store is still locally owned. People still live above the shops. The post office is still in its original 1960s location. Fun fact, when they started the Bavarian transformation in 1965, critics called it desperate and ridiculous. Now Leavenworth gets over 2 million visitors annually, according to the Chamber of Commerce. The fake Bavarian village became one of Washington's most successful tourist destinations. But walk through at 7 a.m. before the tourists arrive and you see what's actually there: a small mountain town that functions like it's 1965, just wearing a costume. Picture this: early morning in winter, snow on the Cascades, ice on the Wenatchee River. You walk down Front Street before the shops open, see the original building shapes under the Bavarian decoration, smell coffee from the local roaster, hear the quiet that small towns used to have before traffic took over. Strip away the paint and murals, and you're looking at mid-century America. The trade-offs are significant. Tourism is the economy. You're either in the service industry or you're commuting elsewhere. Housing is expensive. Winters are cold and snowy. The nearest city of any size is Wenatchee, 30 minutes away. But you're living in a town that kept its downtown alive, kept local businesses functioning, kept the walkable scale that most of America paved over for parking lots. One local business owner told us, "People come for the Bavarian thing, but what keeps them here is the fact that downtown works the way it used to work. You can walk to everything. You know your neighbors. That's not Bavarian. That's just how America used to be." From the mountain town that hid its preservation under a costume, we head east to Pennsylvania coal country, where a town died so thoroughly it became a museum, and the museum never closed. Number 5. Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. The Coal Town Museum. Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. Population 4,600, tucked into the Lehigh Gorge in the Pocono Mountains, where the rivers run fast and the hills rise steep. This is anthracite coal country. The hardest coal, the cleanest burning. The reason these mountains were carved up and these valleys were filled with railroads and immigrant labor, and the kind of brutal industrial wealth that built the Gilded Age. In 1965, this town was still called Mauch Chunk, a Lenape Lenape name meaning Bear Mountain. The coal industry was dying, the mines were closing, the railroads were consolidating, the town was hemorrhaging population and purpose. Then something desperate happened. The town bought the body of Jim Thorpe, the legendary Olympian and athlete, and changed the town's name to his. It was a publicity stunt, a Hail Mary, an attempt to become something other than a dying coal town. It failed. Or rather, it succeeded in a way nobody expected. The name change brought attention, but not salvation. The economy kept declining, the population kept falling, and the entire Victorian downtown, built in the coal boom of the 1880s to 1920s, sat empty, decaying, too expensive to demolish, and too worthless to redevelop. By the 1970s and 80s, Jim Thorpe was a museum by default. The ornate Victorian buildings, the narrow streets designed for horses and trolleys, the opera house and churches and commercial blocks, all preserved because nobody could afford to tear them down. Then tourists started showing up, not for coal history, for the architecture, for the trains, for the sheer frozen-in-time quality of a town that looked exactly like an 1880s to 1960s coal town should look. According to the Jim Thorpe Historic District, designated in 1977, the downtown contains over 200 contributing structures, most built between 1860 and 1930, with minimal alteration through the 1960s and preservation efforts beginning in the 1970s. The Mosh Chunk Opera House, built in 1882, still hosts performances. The Asa Packer Mansion, built in 1861, operates as a museum exactly as it was left. The train station, opened in 1888, still boards passengers for scenic railroad trips. Downtown shops operate from storefronts that haven't changed facades since 1920. The Harry Packer Mansion, now an inn, looks exactly as it did when built in 1874. St. Mark's Episcopal Church, built in 1869, holds services in a sanctuary that could be a movie set for a Victorian drama. This isn't restored in the Disney sense. This is just old, maintained, never replaced. Median home prices in Jim Thorpe run around $275,000 per Zillow data. That buys you a Victorian home, often with original details, original woodwork, original everything, because when the coal money left, nobody could afford to update. The population in 1960 was around 5,800. Today it's roughly 4,600. They lost 20% of their people, but kept 100% of their buildings. Here's the preservation paradox. Jim Thorpe succeeded by failing completely. The coal economy died, the railroad jobs left, the population collapsed, and in that collapse, nobody had money to tear down the old town and build something modern. By the time tourism arrived in the 1980s and 90s, everything worth saving was still there because economic desperation had prevented its destruction. Picture this: fall afternoon in Jim Thorpe, leaves turning gold and red on the mountains. You walk up Broadway, past Victorian storefronts with hand-painted signs, hear the whistle of the tourist railroad echoing off the gorge, smell wood smoke from chimneys and houses that heated with coal for a century before anyone put in forced air. It's beautiful, haunting, and slightly eerie, like walking through a town that the modern world forgot to demolish. The trade-offs are mountain isolation and economic reality. Jim Thorpe is 2 hours from Philadelphia, 90 minutes from Allentown, and the local economy is almost entirely tourism and hospitality. Median household income is around $48,000, according to Census Bureau data. Winter is cold and long. The streets are steep and narrow, designed for a different era. If you need a job that isn't serving tourists or maintaining old buildings, you're commuting out. But you're living in a town that looks like the 1880s to 1960s, not because someone designed a theme park, but because the economy collapsed at exactly the moment that made preservation inevitable. The Victorians built these towns to last centuries. Jim Thorpe proved they were right. One Preservation Society member told us, "People think we restored Jim Thorpe. We didn't. We just didn't have money to wreck it. By the time anyone cared, it was too valuable to destroy. That's not vision, that's luck." From Pennsylvania coal country, we head back west to Utah, where a uranium boomtown kept its 1960s bones even as it became famous for something completely different. Number 4, Moab, Utah. Before it was cool. Moab, Utah. Population 5,400, sitting on the Colorado River where Red Rock Desert meets Canyon Country, and the landscape looks like Mars decided to be beautiful. Today, Moab is famous for mountain biking, off-roading, Arches National Park, adventure tourism, and trust fund kids in $80,000 Sprinter vans pretending to be outdoorsy. But in 1965, Moab was a uranium mining town, a ranching town, and a very quiet place where locals worked hard and didn't expect outsiders to care. The uranium boom hit Moab in the 1950s. The Atomic Energy Commission needed fuel for weapons and power plants, and the Colorado Plateau had it. Charlie Steen struck it rich in 1952 with the Mi Vida mine, built a mansion on a hill overlooking town, and suddenly Moab was flush with mining money. By 1965, the boom was still going, though starting to slow. The town had that rough-edge western feel. Miners, ranchers, river guides, locals who'd been there for generations. Then the uranium market collapsed in the 1970s and 80s. The mines closed. The mill shut down, leaving a contaminated pile that's still being cleaned up today. Moab should have become another boom-bust casualty. Instead, something else happened. Mountain bikers discovered the slick rock, climbers discovered the towers, river runners discovered the canyons, and Moab became an adventure tourism mecca. But here's what's remarkable. The old downtown core from the uranium days is still there, largely unchanged. According to the Moab Historic Preservation Commission, the downtown commercial district contains numerous structures from the 1940s to 1960s, many still operating in their original capacity or slightly modified. The old uranium-era buildings are still standing, still in use, just serving espresso instead of miners. The Moab Diner has operated since the 1950s, still serving breakfast to locals who remember when the town was boring. Woody's Tavern has been pouring drinks since 1949. The old motor lodges from the 50s and 60s, originally built for miners and families visiting the parks, are still operating, now charging $200 a night in peak season because adventure tourism pays better than uranium ever did. The old Miners Bar still serves locals at 7 a.m. The difference is now they're sitting next to a guy from Boulder wearing $400 worth of Patagonia who just called Moab authentic. The miners don't correct him. They just order another coffee and enjoy the irony. Center Street still has the same layout it had in 1965. The courthouse, built in 1958, still anchors downtown. The old gas stations, updated slightly, still pump gas. The buildings haven't been torn down and replaced with modern construction. They've been maintained, repurposed, repainted, but not demolished. Median home prices in Moab now run around $550,000 per Zillow data, inflated by tourism money and second home buyers. But the town itself hasn't sprawled into strip malls and chain stores the way most American towns did. The core is still compact, walkable, recognizable from its uranium days. Here's what preservation by repurposing looks like. Moab didn't keep its 1960s buildings out of nostalgia. They kept them because when uranium crashed, there was no money for redevelopment, and by the time adventure tourism brought money back, the old buildings were functional, and the tourists actually liked the rough edge authenticity. So the old motor lodges stayed, the old diners stayed, the old storefronts stayed. They just started serving a different economy. Picture this: early morning in downtown Moab before the mountain bikers wake up. The sun rises behind the La Salle Mountains, lighting up the red cliffs. You smell coffee from the shops that used to serve miners. Hear the quiet before the gear shops open. See the old neon signs from the 1960s, updated but not replaced, starting to fade as daylight takes over. The bones of uranium-era Moab are still visible if you know where to look. The trade-offs are tourism overload and cost. Moab in peak season is overwhelmed. Traffic, crowds, noise, lines at every restaurant. Housing is expensive and hard to find. Jobs are mostly service industry. If you're not in tourism or outdoor industry, opportunities are limited. The desert heat hits 100 plus in summer. Winter is quiet and cold. You're 230 miles from Salt Lake City, 125 miles from Grand Junction, isolated in Red Rock country, but you're living in a town that went from uranium to adventure without tearing down what uranium built. The old Moab is still there under the new Moab. The locals who remember the mining days still drink at the same bars. The downtown is still walkable, human scale, functional. It's not 1965 anymore, but the buildings remember. One longtime resident whose family has been in Moab since the uranium days told us, "People come here now for the rocks and the trails, but what they're really paying for is a town that still feels real. We didn't preserve that on purpose. We just couldn't afford to wreck it, and by the time we could, we didn't want to." From the red rocks of Utah, we head north to Montana, where a railroad town lost its reason for being and became a different kind of destination without losing its working class soul. Number 3, Livingston, Montana. The railroad division town, Livingston, Montana. Population 8,000, sitting in the Paradise Valley where the Yellowstone River cuts north toward the plains, and the mountains rise like cathedrals on 3 sides. This is railroad country, built in 1882 when the Northern Pacific Railway came through, established as a division point where crews changed, engines were serviced, and the railroad ran the town completely. In 1965, Livingston was still a railroad town. Burlington Northern employed hundreds. The railroad shops were operational. The depot, a grand Victorian structure built in 1902, was the center of town life. Train whistles marked the day. Workers lived in the same houses their grandfathers had lived in, walked the same streets, drank in the same bars. It was solid, working class, unpretentious. It was Montana before Montana became a real estate fantasy for billionaires. Then the railroad left. Burlington Northern consolidated operations, closed the shops, moved crews to other division points. The depot became a museum. The jobs disappeared. Livingston in the 1970s and 80s faced what every railroad town faced: irrelevance. The reason for being was gone, but something kept Livingston alive. Writers, artists, people who wanted a real Montana town, not a Jackson Hole resort fantasy. Jim Harrison, Thomas McGuane, Russell Chatham, they settled in Livingston and wrote about it, painted it, made it famous to a particular type of person who valued authenticity over amenities. The result was a town that preserved itself by being too real to gentrify completely. According to the Montana Historical Society, Livingston's downtown historic district contains 417 contributing structures, most dating from 1880 to 1940, with significant buildings from the 1950s and 60s largely intact. The Murray Bar, open since 1904, still serves railroad workers' grandkids and writers' hangovers. The Livingston Depot, completed in 1902, operates as a museum in a building that hasn't changed. The old railroad housing, simple bungalows from the 1910s to 1940s, still houses locals. Downtown Livingston looks like a railroad town from the 1960s because it is. The Mint Bar has been pouring drinks since the 1940s. Gill's Goods, a vintage store, operates from a 1905 building that was originally a mercantile. The old hotel buildings, motor lodges from the 50s and 60s, the bars where railroad workers drank, they're all still there. Functional, lived in, not precious. Median home prices in Livingston run around $475,000 per Zillow data. That's elevated by Bozeman spillover and out-of-state buyers, but still less than most mountain towns with this much character. The population in 1960 was roughly 6,900. Today it's around 8,000. They grew by 15% in 65 years. Slow, steady, without losing the railroad town bones. Here's the preservation model that worked. Livingston never got rich enough to tear itself down, but it attracted just enough artists and writers and people who valued what it was to prevent complete decline. The result is a hybrid. Still working class enough to be real, cultured enough to have good restaurants and an independent bookstore, preserved enough that the railroad era architecture is intact. Picture this: winter evening in Livingston, snow falling on the Absaroka Mountains. You walk down Main Street past storefronts that haven't changed facades since 1940, hear live music from the Murray Bar, smell wood smoke from chimneys and houses built for railroad workers a century ago. It feels solid, earned, unpretentious. Montana before it became a luxury brand. The trade-offs are Montana's scale and climate. Winters are brutal. Weeks below zero, wind that cuts through everything. The nearest commercial airport is Bozeman, 30 minutes away. Jobs are limited. Tourism, hospitality, ranching support, writing if you can make it work. Median household income is around $52,000 according to census data. If you need a corporate career or specialized medical care, you're looking elsewhere. But you're living in a railroad town that survived the death of railroads by being exactly what it always was: real, functional, unpretentious. The bars are still local. The downtown is still walkable. The architecture is still intact. It's not 1965 anymore, but the bones remember when it was. One bar owner whose family has been in Livingston since the railroad days told us, "We didn't preserve the town. We just kept living here. The railroad left, the writers came, the tourists showed up, and the buildings were still here because nobody ever had money to tear them down. Now they call it historic. We call it Tuesday." From Montana railroad country, we head back to New Mexico, where a town changed its name for a radio show and then froze in place like the punchline to a joke that never ended. Number 2. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, the spy town that stopped. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Population 5,900, sitting on the Rio Grande in the high desert where hot springs bubble up from the earth and the landscape looks like God forgot to add vegetation. The town was originally named Hot Springs. Straightforward, descriptive, boring. Then in 1950, Ralph Edwards, host of the radio show Truth or Consequences, announced he'd broadcast from any town willing to rename itself after his show. Hot Springs bit. They held a referendum, changed the name, and became Truth or Consequences. It was a publicity stunt that worked. Ralph Edwards came to town every year for the anniversary. The name change got national attention. The hot springs resorts were already established. People had been coming here for the healing waters since the early 1900s, and the new name brought more visitors. By 1965, Truth or Consequences was a thriving spa town. Motor courts with hot spring baths, hotels with therapeutic pools, bathhouses serving everyone from arthritis patients to families on vacation. Then the interstate bypassed the town in the 1970s. Traffic disappeared. The spa industry declined as air conditioning made southern New Mexico feel less like a destination and more like a place to escape from. By the 1980s and 90s, Truth or Consequences was struggling, declining, losing population and purpose. But here's what didn't change: the spa infrastructure. The motor courts from the 1940s to 1960s, built around hot springs pools, are still operating. According to the Sierra County Tourism Bureau, approximately 10 historic bathhouses and hot springs resorts continue operating, most in buildings dating from 1930 to 1965, with minimal structural alteration. The original mid-century architecture, simple, functional, built around the springs, is still intact. Blackstone Hot Springs, operating since 1950, still offers private hot springs pools in a building that looks exactly like a 1950s motor court. Sierra Grande Lodge, built in the 1920s, renovated in the 1960s, still serves guests in a structure that hasn't been gutted or modernized beyond necessity. Riverbend Hot Springs operates from a property established in the 1930s. The baths are the same. The buildings are the same. The experience is the same. Downtown Truth or Consequences, along Broadway and Date Street, retains its mid-century small-town character. According to the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division, the downtown contains numerous contributing structures from 1920 to 1970. The old hotels, the bathhouses, the storefronts that served spa tourists in 1965 are still there. Some vacant, some operating, all looking like they're waiting for 1965 to come back. Median home prices in Truth or Consequences run around $185,000 per Zillow data. That's for an actual house in a town with hot springs access, which is either a bargain or a warning sign depending on your perspective. The population in 1960 was approximately 4,600. Today it's around 5,900. They grew by about 25%, slow and unsteady, with periods of decline and modest recovery. Here's the economic reality: Truth or Consequences never died completely because the hot springs don't stop being hot springs. As long as the water keeps bubbling up, there's a reason for the town to exist, but it also never thrived enough to demolish the old and build new. The result is a spa town that looks and operates almost identically to how it did in 1965, not by choice, but by economic stagnation that accidentally preserved everything. Picture this: evening at a hot springs bathhouse in Truth or Consequences. You're soaking in 108-degree mineral water in a building that was already old when Kennedy was president. The only sounds are the water bubbling and someone's grandfather snoring in the next pool. The bathhouse hasn't been renovated because the water doesn't care what decade the tile is from. Neither do you. The sun drops behind the mountains, turning the desert pink and orange. You smell the mineral water and the desert sage. The experience is identical to what visitors felt in 1955. Time didn't stop. It just slowed to geological pace. The trade-offs are isolation, heat, and limited economy. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees. The nearest city of any size is Las Cruces, an hour south. Jobs are sparse. Tourism, government, healthcare, and not much else. Median household income is around $35,000, according to census data. The town struggles with poverty, aging infrastructure, and the question of whether it's preserved or just abandoned. But the hot springs still work. The mid-century bathhouses still function. And if you wanted to know what a small spa town felt like in 1965, before wellness became a luxury industry, before hot springs resorts became boutique destinations, Truth or Consequences consequences is still living that reality. One bathhouse owner whose family has run the place since 1962 told us, "We didn't keep it like 1965 on purpose. We just never made enough money to change it. Now people come here because it's authentic. Turns out broke and authentic look the same from the outside." From the New Mexico Hot Springs town that stopped by accident, we drive north to Idaho, to the town that stopped on purpose, looked at progress, and said no thanks. This is where defiance met preservation and won. Number 1. Wallace, Idaho, the town that refused to change. Wallace, Idaho, population 784, tucked into a narrow canyon in the Silver Valley, where the mountains press so close you can stand downtown and hit either hillside with a good throw. This is silver mining country, hard rock country, the kind of place that produced more ore and more labor battles than anywhere in the West. In 1965, Wallace was a working mining town with a fully operational red light district, legal brothels operating openly until 1988, the last in the nation. Wallace should have become a footnote, another mining town that collapsed when the ore ran out. But something happened that made Wallace different. The interstate was coming, and Wallace said no. In the 1970s, the Federal Highway Administration planned Interstate 90 to run straight through downtown Wallace. The route would have demolished dozens of historic buildings, gutted the commercial core, turned Wallace into another highway town with gas stations and chain motels on the exits. Standard practice. What happened to 10,000 American towns? Wallace refused. The city fought the federal government for years. They lost in court repeatedly. The interstate was coming. Then in 1976, the entire downtown was designated a National Historic District, one of the largest in the nation, 615 contributing structures, virtually the entire town. And suddenly, demolishing downtown for a highway meant demolishing a National Historic District, which brought different rules and different scrutiny. The fight lasted until the 1990s. Wallace eventually compromised. The interstate would go around, not through, but the damage was done elsewhere, or rather, wasn't done in Wallace. While other towns were being carved up by interstates, demolished for parking lots, rebuilt into strip malls, Wallace was frozen in legal battles. By the time the fight ended, preservation had become the town's identity. According to the National Park Service, Wallace's historic district contains buildings spanning 1880 to 1960 with exceptional integrity. The Jameson Hotel, built in 1900, still operates. The 1313 Club, a bar that was a brothel until 1988, still serves drinks. The Northern Pacific Depot, built in 1901, now houses a visitor center. Downtown Wallace looks like a mining town from 1965 because nothing has been allowed to change. The storefronts retain their original facades, the brick buildings, the Victorian architecture, the working class bars and hotels. It's all still there, not restored in the precious sense, just maintained, occupied, functional. You can walk down Bank Street and see exactly what a Silver Valley mining town looked like in 1965, before the interstate, before the chains, before progress decided downtowns were disposable. Median home prices in Wallace run around $285,000 per Zillow data. That's relatively high for a town of 784 people in northern Idaho, but you're buying a piece of Western history in a town that has become a destination precisely because it refused to modernize. The population in 1960 was approximately 1,950. Today it's 784. They lost 60% of their people, but kept 100% of their buildings. That's not a preservation strategy you'll find in an urban planning textbook, but Wallace wasn't asking for permission. If Seligman refused to die, Wallace refused to even acknowledge the concept of death. Here's what active preservation looks like. Wallace didn't freeze by accident or economic collapse. They made a choice. They fought the federal government and won, or at least didn't lose completely. They turned their stubbornness into an identity. Now, tourists come specifically to see a Western mining town that looks exactly like it did in the mid-20th century, complete with the slightly rough edges that come from real history, not theme park recreation. Fun fact, Wallace calls itself the center of the universe and has a manhole covered downtown to prove it. In 2004, the mayor declared that since no one could definitively prove Wallace wasn't the center of the universe, it must be. That's the kind of town this is. Defiant, quirky, serious about not taking itself too seriously, and absolutely committed to being exactly what it's always been. Picture this, late afternoon in Wallace, sun dropping behind the mountains, shadow filling the narrow canyon. You stand on Bank Street, surrounded by brick buildings from the 1890s to 1960s. Hear the river running through town, smell pine from the mountains and beer from the bars. It looks like a movie set, but the mines were real, the brothels were real, the fight against the interstate was real, and the town's refusal to become like everywhere else is still real. The trade-offs are significant. Wallace is remote, 90 miles east of Spokane, surrounded by mountains, isolated in a way that most Americans can't imagine. Winters are long and snowy, jobs are limited, tourism, government, and not much else. Median household income is around $43,000, according to census data. The population is aging. If you need a career, or specialized medical care, or anything that requires a city, you're leaving, but you're living in the last stoplight on Interstate 90, the town that looked at progress and said, no, we're good. The place that preserved 1965 by refusing to become 1975. The buildings are the same. The bars are the same. The stubborn, independent, slightly defiant spirit is the same. One longtime resident whose family mined silver here for 3 generations told us, people think we kept Old Wallace because we're sentimental. We're not sentimental. We're just not interested in being like everywhere else. We know what we have, and we're not trading it for a Walmart and a freeway exit. That's Wallace. That's the #1 town that stopped in 1965 before everything changed. They didn't stop by accident, they stopped on purpose. And they're still stopped, still defiant, still the center of their own universe. 8 towns, 8 different reasons for stopping. Some bypassed by interstates, some collapsed economically at exactly the right moment, some preserved by poverty, some by geography, some by deliberate choice. But all of them kept something the rest of America bulldozed. The architecture, the scale, the local ownership, the human pace of life that used to be normal before we decided normal meant chain stores and strip malls. Seligman refused to die when Route 66 was bypassed. Silver City attracted artists who preserved what miners built. Leavenworth disguised preservation under a Bavarian costume. Jim Thorpe became a museum by accident. Moab repurposed its uranium bones for adventure tourism. Livingston survived by being real enough for writers and locals alike. Truth or Consequences kept the hot springs running and everything else stopped. Wallace fought the interstate and won. These aren't theme parks. They're not historical reenactments. They're living towns where people work, raise families, pay taxes, and live in buildings that remember 1965 because they were built before 1965 and never torn down after. The neon signs are original. The storefronts are original. The diners and bars and motor lodges are original. Time didn't stop. Progress just went around. And here's what needs to be said. Maybe they made the right call. Maybe what we demolished in the name of progress, the walkable downtowns, the local businesses, the human scale, the architecture with character, maybe that was worth keeping. These towns prove it was possible. It required stubbornness, poverty, geographic isolation, or deliberate choice, but it was possible. If this resonated with you, if you remember when towns looked like this, if you're tired of every place looking exactly the same, hit that like button. Share this with someone who remembers. Subscribe if you want more stories about the America we're losing and the places that refuse to let go. Drop a comment. Which of these towns surprised you? Which one would you actually move to? The towns that stopped in 1965 are still there. Most of them are struggling. Some are thriving. All of them are proof that the way we built America before the interstate highway system worked. It worked socially. It worked economically. It worked architecturally. We chose to demolish it anyway, but not everywhere. Not in these 8 towns.